Hey everyone, welcome to Toronto Data Workshop. So today's guest is Wendy Foster, who works at Shopify. Wendy is Director of Engineering and Data of Optimize at Shopify. And so thank you very much for joining us, Wendy. Very much looking forward to your talk.
Oh, thank you so much, Rohan, and everybody for having me in today. I'm going to talk about data integrity and governance and try, it's a massive topic, so try and frame it in on a couple of key applications in like the field, so hopefully make it a little bit more tangible to all of you. Just to repeat a little bit about me. I am a director of engineering and data at Shopify, so it's software development and our data engineering groups. We built the analytic products that help our merchants understand their businesses better. So if you're a Shopify merchant or have a Shopify shop, we have a little section in admin where you can see your reporting, recommendations for business actions, and dashboarding, typical analytic experiences. My teams are also pretty interesting because we actually build also a domain-specific language. We call it Shopify QL. And that's our query language of commerce. So think of a query language where the syntax enables you to ask more natural language questions of like your data, to be able to interrogate it a little more deeply in using the language of business. And this is leveraged like internally. We build our products on top of this, but also other teams across Shopify and third-party developers build analytic experiences using our API on this. So just really briefly too, before I came to Shopify, I was the director of engineering at PagerDuty. I managed our data platform, machine learning, and software development teams who built out AI ops solutions for PagerDuty. So those of you who are working in industry right now and have incident operations, probably already using PagerDuty. And prior to that, for the Toronto folks, I was the director of data products at Wattpad, pretty well-known Toronto startup, and I led our search and recommendation teams. Okay, so just a little bit to go over the agenda today. I'll dig into a little bit about what data integrity and data governance is. And then I'll spend most of our time on implementation approaches. So these are like conceptual architectures that'll help us understand how data integrity and data governance can be implemented in organizations. And then I'll have a little bit of Q&A. I have some questions for all of you. Hopefully you have some questions for me. I will also pause as I go through the presentation, so you have opportunities to ask questions along the way. And then some resources on some of the architectural approaches to data governance that I thought would be really interesting for folks to follow up on. So that's just a little bit of an overview of where we'll spend our time. So I'll start off just talking a little, literally a sentence about what data integrity is, because it's part of a much broader landscape of governance. But data integrity in a nutshell is the assurance of the accuracy, reliability, and consistency of data over time. And it's a part of larger data governance strategies. So when we think about data governance, what we really understand that to be are the people, the processes, and the technology that govern data integrity and trust over the complete life cycle of data within an organization. So data governance is extraordinarily broad, notoriously difficult to implement, and really culturally challenging for organizations attempting to merge regulatory and compliance measures with cross-cutting data management and access strategies. And we'll go into a little bit of the complexities of trying to implement data governance strategies at organizations, but they're notorious for being very, very hard to do. Okay, so we'll dive into that. So why is data governance and building trust in an organization's data so hard? So when I think about this, I think it's because it is often an investment without effective investment. So what I mean by effective investment is really in growing the mind share and ensuring that all parts of your organization not just the data lifecycle, are aligned on the what, why, and the how. Governance initiatives are more prone to organizational dysfunction than most other business strategies. And just in my experience, they often lack clear process and implementation guidance to get those processes into place. Like, honestly, even thinking about how to tackle this subject today was challenging. Went through numerous like iterations and like what I wanted to talk about. But in the end, I decided to focus on a foundation introduction to data governance, and a walkthrough of two important implementation architectures in the field today, that have been more helpful than anything else, in my opinion, to operationalize data governance on the ground. So that's data mesh and data fabric architectures. And those are like clearly our implementation approaches. So both data mesh and data fabric approaches are frameworks that can help guide the implementation of data governance strategy. Each approach does have their own trade-offs, and we're going to talk a little bit about how they differ, and why mesh or fabric have different organizational implications. So like in a nutshell, let me see if it's better in here. Go back. I'll get there in a second. Like just in a nutshell, if we think about, can go back. Perfect. Data mesh is a federated model. So what it does is it decentralizes data management to domain teams. We'll unpack that a little bit in a second. And in practice, we can think of a data mesh framework as a domain managed like data products, which are owned and operated autonomously. Data mesh frameworks focus on organizational transformation to be effective, while data fabric, we'll see this later as well, seek to create a unified single source of truth layer for supporting the data lifecycle. And we'll unpack what that means. All right, so I'm going to start out with like the data mesh and some principles there. So I have a link to like these resources at the end as well, but Zhamak Dehghani was the first person who really proposed the data mesh architecture. She did this while she was a consultant at ThoughtWorks. And she outlined 4 principles that are key to data mesh implementation and success. So I have them listed out here, but I'm going to walk through them in a little more detail. The first principle she outlined is called domain-driven data ownership. So data is owned under this principle by individual domain teams. So you can think of these typically as business units. This configuration aligns ownership and the management of data products and their governance, of course, like more closely with business domains versus the actual technology you would use to manage them. So outside of like your technology like stack, such as like a data lake or a warehouse. So when we talked a little bit before about data meshes requiring organizational transformation, it's typically around the domain ownership principle. Like we can see this most like acutely. So domain ownership can pretty dramatically shift how organizations like think about and govern data. And there's implications here for data architecture, self-serve capabilities, and federated governance. And we'll talk about some of those challenges when we get to some of the other principles attached to the data mesh architecture. But some of the obvious benefits we would see here around domain ownership include clarity of ownership. So an example of that concretely is like a marketing team would own marketing data. Finance teams would own finance data. So the domain ownership is clearly beneficial here. It improves scalability. It removes bottlenecks that we can see with a lot of centralized like data engineering practices that those can introduce. And the data mesh also promises improved data quality. And this is because of like the domain localization of it. We typically think that like the domain owners are the data experts. So they're best like situated to define their data products and keep them owned and operated with higher clarity than when it's centralized, and that expertise doesn't exist within that centralized, like oftentimes a platform team. And like one of the thoughts underlying here too is that data mesh architectures can improve agility because of that domain expertise as well. So can drive accelerated delivery of new data products. The domain teams like own the strategy and the implementation. But I'll say here, just as an asterisk, the most effective data mesh architectures do centralize platform capabilities and tooling that lets them like build very, very quickly, and they don't have to worry about the like each domain team having to stand up its own platform capabilities. So there is a centralized like element here as well. And so just to move on, the second principle of a data mesh implementation is the concept of data as a product. So data products, by their nature, they need to be discoverable, trustworthy, accessible through common interfaces. Data mesh contracts are used here, as well as versioning strategy and access constraints. Like the list actually goes on quite long. So these are governance conventions at the data product layer. And this ensures that a well-defined contribution and a consumer model is documented so that other teams can make use of the data products built by another domain with clear expectations. And when I think about like data mesh, like architectures, especially the data product like component and its ownership by domain teams, I think of this like kind of like as an API first like strategy, right? So all of the data products that you're building, think of this as like at its like probably easiest to understand like level as like a data model. You want other teams and other parts of your organization to be able to access that and access it safely and have trust in it. So that's where the contracts and those interfaces are incredibly important. So our third principle is self-serve. So the self-serve principle for data meshes, this goes back again to the idea of a centralized data platform and tooling to support the decentralized domain data product creation. So a self-serve data platform ensures that like from your, I guess your ingest like point to the access points, the domain team is supported and is able to build very, very quickly. So at this layer, you'll often see like components such as security and data discovery. So that could be cataloging, data model registry, and the orchestration pieces actually owned centrally by the platform. Those are leveraged by like the domain teams. So there's continuity for like how you build on top. And you have like some assurances that the platform can give you there. And again, like the most important part of the mesh concept is that the domain teams like are leveraging like the platform, but own the schemas and the business logic for the data models. And then the fourth principle is probably one of the most important for data meshes, and it's federated governance. So think of this as some like set of automated compliance measures. So if anyone on the call has had to work with GDPR, that's General Data Protection Regulation requirements. Probably one of the best examples here, SOC compliance is another one. When you centralize tooling for compliance on the platform side, while you have your domain teams leveraging the tools provided, this is where like you get like some of the assurances that the platform owns all of the compliance protocols. Those are automated. So the domain teams can focus on being responsible for onboarding their data to the platform, fixing like compliance flags if there's any. Think of this as a bit of a virtuous like circle. So just to summarize here, data mesh is a business domain focused approach. It decentralizes data ownership while centralizing platform capabilities, and that codifies and supports decentralized domain governance. Data mesh is a super popular approach, and we'll get into how it can fit into like data fabric operations as well, but it's really, really popular, especially more recently because of its business centricity. When I talked before about like the kind of like dysfunction of governance initiatives, like historically, it's been around like the lack of like mindshare about like data meshes and data fabric architectures, as we'll see in a second, like have actually made this like much, much easier for organizations to manage because they're not just like technology stacks, they're conceptual frameworks that people can understand really, really clearly and develop that mindshare buy-in for. So this is super important to making these these governance initiatives like effective. So data, like just to like recap us, data mesh implementations function according to 4 principles. And data mesh really is about prioritizing the people and the processes. I think this comes clear through the principles. And it includes like the domain ownership, treating data as a product, the self-service governance support, and the federated governance practices and tooling. So I'm going to walk us through like the fabric architecture, and then I'm going to pause for some questions, and then we can wrap this up, just because I want like you to be able to put the data fabric orientation in context of like data mesh, just when you're thinking about any questions you want to deep dive into. Okay. So the second major paradigm for supporting data governance is what's called the data fabric architecture. As we'll see, like data fabric architectures are far more focused on like the technology side of the equation. When I said like governance is about people, processes, and technology, mesh cares more about the people and the processes. Data fabric cares more actually about the technology. And it mostly seeks to automate data management through the use of AI or machine learning versus delegating that data management to the domain teams. So I think as its name suggests, it's a framework that covers or centralizes, often it's talked about as unifying data access and use across a whole organization. And fabrics are technology centered, as I said, versus organizationally centered, as we saw with data meshes. So data fabric approaches seek to implement what's called the single source of truth for data. So that's centralizing data integrity dimensions, such as quality, consistency, and security, and supporting really, really easy access to data. So often like data fabric, like architectures are no or low code. And you can really think of it as a unified data platform. And like the thing that makes it or can make it a little tricky for organizations is that it's general purpose. So unlike data meshes, it's not specifically domain sensitive. So and it really is like driven by like metadata. So the data models as an example, like if we just look at like data model onboarding into data discovery, like systems, like your schemas have to be very, very well defined. You have to ensure that like your columns and your fields are well like labeled in order for data fabric architectures to work as intended and work well. And also the thing people like tend to actually really, really like about data fabric, like I'll call them stacks, but they're probably more connected components, is that they tend to be give you real-time affordances. And there's some interesting work that's been done on data virtualization for data source connection. I'll talk a little bit about this as we go through the enablement like layers, but it's essentially makes data fabrics make it essentially like incredibly easy to be able to connect diverse like data sources across different like databases and storage centers. It's one of its big advantages. So for data fabric implementations, again, automation across data discovery and delivery is key. So when we think of data mesh architectures, again, just to like reiterate, because I think this is an important distinction, where data mesh architectures foreground the people and the processes parts of data governance. Data fabric is like explicitly technology centric. So one of the biggest benefits we see with some data fabric approaches, there's some good examples. I'm going to talk about it a little bit like later in the presentation, but good examples from almost every single like cloud provider that makes creating like fabrics incredibly easy. But like its biggest like leverage point is the use of intelligent systems to integrate data stored in multiple locations and in diverse formats. So with data fabric architectures, like we generally think of them as an accelerator for insight generation and a key to eliminating knowledge silos. Where I have mostly seen data fabric approaches implemented is at massive like enterprise organizations. So if you think of organizations with complex global structures, that will have the need for data integration from many different like sources. You're probably looking at an organization that would benefit from a data fabric. As an example, in a conference I went to like last year, I talked to some like enterprise data leaders who leverage fabric architectures to handle the integration of data from sources that would otherwise be honestly like next to impossible to merge and manage. So globally dispersed data with both digital as well as brick and mortar data sources, and each of those like digital and brick and mortar sources had their own data collection and storage strategy. So just even hearing about how they were set up like historically, you can see it would be incredibly challenging to understand without technology supports, just to bring those sources together, integrate them meaningfully. Historically, like organizations like think of grocery store like enterprises, or was another one like food and beverage, like Tim Hortons is a good example here. I haven't talked to them specifically, but like their data is spread out across like so many different like source types. It was like just a nightmare to have to try and manually link those sources together to get holistic like insight generation or business reporting available. So in data fabric implementations, one thing I'll call out here too is that data observability and data ops like functions become super critical to managing the system. Won't really get into like those here, but I flag it because it's a really interesting kind of like side quest when you're thinking about governance, to start looking at machine learning ops and data ops as fields that are more critical now than ever, especially given the breadth in fabric architectures of this kind of single layer coverage solution and interoperability points the data fabrics support. They're pretty manifold. So you can think of how a data fabric architecture works as stitching together the essential components or layers of end-to-end or whole lifecycle data systems. Forrester Group has actually done some really good deep dives here. And they summarize the layer interactions as outlined on the slide. So you start out with like the data management layer. So this is responsible for data governance and data security. You have the data ingestion layer. So this stitches together essentially all your cloud data, intelligently locating connections. Again, that's automated, that's machine learning driven, and conforming structured and unstructured like data. So this is where you get like the holistic opportunity to generate insights where it wasn't really possible before. And then you have the data processing layer. So this refines the data and ensures relevance for extraction. The orchestration layer within the data fabric helps to transform, integrate, clean, or process the data. So basically, like at the orchestration layer, it's all the practices that actually make data useful, usable for businesses. And then we have the discovery layer. There's lots of incredible work being done on this layer, even outside of fabric architectures, like more recently, especially like given advances in generative AI and large language models. Discovery has always been challenging for data. So you can think of this layer as like really being able to identify, it's like Forrester describes it actually interestingly, because they're like, it's at this data discovery layer where you can identify opportunities to integrate disparate data sources for knowledge creation. I find this super fascinating because like this layer would be able to see and instantiate connections between different data systems in play to help the business improve. So a typical example here is that the layer being able to see connections between supply chain data as an example and customer relationship management data. So those connections to like a human may not be visible. The data sets may be so massive, you don't see the opportunities for how to connect them, but that being able to be intelligently like detected, automated, and connected, like opens up a whole new universe for businesses to be able to recommend new or better products to customers, just as an example. It's actually like pretty groundbreaking here. And then, of course, we have as the sixth layer, the data access layer. So this is the layer that allows for the data to be consumed by teams. And it's also the layer that has permission or access roles defined. And this is where a lot of the compliance automations are present. So at ground level, this is also the layer that teams can use to surface relevant data to stakeholders, so internal reports and dashboards, et cetera. So the big benefit, again, that you get from Data Fabric is that it really does democratize that access layer. And most of the implementations, as I said previously, are low or no code. So when talk about one of the big things that these architectures help to do is remove bottlenecks. The nice piece here is that if you're working at an organization with business stakeholders, data scientists or analysts don't become the bottleneck for insight generation. These kind of architectures can make it easy for your non-technical stakeholders to ask questions of their data as well. And so Gartner has previously done a number of studies on the efficiencies of well-implemented data fabric solutions. So I'll call out a couple of the most important benefits here. We already talked a little bit about the intelligent integrations, but this is a huge milestone for data management. So the use of AI ML, knowledge graphing in particular, and metadata management technologies within data fabric architectures has really just been game-changing for business. So data unification from messy, highly disparate data sources becomes one of the biggest benefits here for streamlining data workflows. And if you think of the power here, the combination of machine learning and knowledge graphing, just alone, those two things, can show or cluster related data sets. They can integrate new data sets for mining in ways that were previously either impossible or incredibly challenging and time consuming to do. It's a little bit magical, to be honest. Other benefit that Gartner's called out is data democratization. I kind of like this just earlier, where that self-serve, low to no code features of most data fabric architectures make data access available to your non-technical users. So again, eliminating the technical bottlenecks. This accelerates time to decisions. And again, just as the canonical example, it's a product manager doesn't need to make a request to a data scientist or a data engineer to get a data point or report made. They can do this super easily on their own. And another benefit is pretty great data protection at any and all of the integration points between layers. So a lot of these data integrity and governance features come out of the box with cloud managed solutions. So things to keep an eye on or to play around with is Google's Dataplex. So Dataplex helps organizations stitch together basically all of the GCP products into a managed data fabric solution. It's looking incredibly promising, and clearly also companies like IBM have amazing solutions for implementing fabric architectures. IBM's, I think it's called CloudPak, and it's for their data platform, and is pretty well used in enterprise. I already go through this. Yeah, so this is the one thing I just wanted to call out before I paused is that data mesh and data fabric implementations are not mutually exclusive. So what you'll see is that many fabric approaches have a data mesh component embedded in them. These combinations, then when you look at how you can bring fabric and mesh together, it makes that combination of people, processes, and technology in the service of data governance much more successful than previously. And this is in my mind because they provide really great examples of how to make governance effective across organizations. They're not just focused on the what and the why. It's I think we've been missing the how for so long. So these are very promising and exciting, and quite frankly super interesting to read about. I think all or most of you are working in the data field, so you know how challenging it can be to get organizational continuity around data initiatives. So having these kinds of architectures and concepts in your back pocket I think can be really, really super powerful. So now I want to open up to Q&A. I do have some seed questions because I'm just curious about data governance in academia in general, but these are mostly just for us to talk about if we don't have anything that bubbles up.
Thank you very much, Wendy. So I'll just get to it. There was a question in the chat first, and if folks have questions or responses here to Wendy's questions, we've run more than 100 of these, and you're the first one who's brought questions, so it's wonderful. But George asked, George, would you like to read out your question, or would you like me to? So I'll just read it out. So George asks, in a world where unstructured data predominates, what should be the data governance paradigm to adopt?
Yeah, like I think this is where like Fabric is super powerful, like especially where it leverages like automated capabilities coming from machine learning, new AI, new AI like innovations, because like the intended power of Fabric architectures is to be able to combine unstructured and structured data very, very easily. So I do think it's like the implicit, or no, it'd be the explicit like affordances for automation that makes Fabric really powerful for unstructured like data as well. And like this is all about like being able to get into a state that's like understandable and communicable, right? So the governance like processes that you centralize like in your platform can help provide some controls, I think, over unstructured data. If I kind of like dig into that question, I say is that the concern that like there's this like massive like unstructured like knowledge, we don't know what's in it, so we can't like control it well enough. The platform piece should help with that.
Yvonne,
At
would you like
source.
to? Oh, sorry, Wendy, were you done?
Oh yeah, I just like
Mhm.
I just threw in like it should help you actually at the source.
Beg your pardon. Yvonne, would you like to?
Yes. Hi. Hello. Thank you so much. Wendy, how would you use this architecture in highly sensitive data like healthcare data? Is that applicable, or something more extra layers that we have to consider?
Yeah, so it's intended like healthcare is probably like a different beast, but I'll relate it to like controls over, we'll say like people data as well as like finance data that I've seen throughout my career. Like historically, in the absence of conceptual like architectures to be able to like automate the controls on them, like in organizations that belonged into like human resources data or finance data had its own like warehousing and control and access like structures that were separate from, let's say, like more production like data that like businesses or product teams could like query. But like the promise of data mesh and data fabric architectures is that you don't have to have special Snowflake implementations for data sources or data data that would require very rigorous security and compliance controls around it. You should be able to manage those differentially within like your platform with these like architectures. That's not to say that like depending on the strength of the controls you need around it, like healthcare for sure, you may still want separate implementations, but these are intended to like be able to help you like manage differential access controls on your sources as you need. And it makes it easier if you can have like that centralized like platform oversight on it versus having to have multiple like teams stand up their own stacks just because of like compliance or security requirements you may have around data. But whether they're implemented like well enough to do that is probably the devil in the detail question.
Yeah, that's good. Thank you so much, Wendy.
No, no worries. Thank you.
Thomas, would you like to ask your own questions?
Oh yeah, hi. Thank you for coming, first of all. And then just in the context of smaller teams or companies with more limited resources, do you have any suggestions? Like if you go with a data mesh approach, or what kind of tooling, especially for non-technical teams like a marketing department, they may not be able to afford like a dedicated engineer or analyst? Like, is there solutions or approaches that you found where you're really empowering these teams to take advantage of the data that they have and are producing and like care about data quality? And so the products
Yeah.
that other teams are working with produced by these non-technical teams are good and like useful.
Yeah, I think like there's always going to be like challenges with non-technical teams having to set up their own like data like infrastructures to manage to do like the knowledge management and the compliance like pieces. So like we probably should have like flags set up around that in our heads to start with. That said, like the state of like cloud managed like ecosystems now like make it incredibly easy to set up like I'll say relatively like reliable and secure data like systems. I would say I don't know how easy it would be for completely non-technical teams to do it, but you look at any of like the Amazon services or like Google like managed services, and like a lot of them are like click integrations with built-in services to manage compliance and like PII controls. So I think it's possible to these architectures. I don't know that I would think it was like great for teams working with data not to have technical implementers on that though.
So you probably still need someone to back them up,
Well,
even if
yeah,
they're
at least
not
like an
integrated
IT
in the team.
team.
Okay, that makes
Yeah,
sense.
yeah, I would say so.
Thomas, you had a
Like,
second one, but so do you want to
Oh yeah,
just go to
they
that?
kind of lead into
Rajneesh,
my
is that all
second
right?
one.
But there's plenty of time.
Yeah, you kind of touched on the cloud tooling. I'm just wondering, especially for a small organization, this may not be as relevant to your work at Shopify, but do you think that the cost benefit is there, like for the expenses that you might be paying in
yeah,
addition? Okay,
yeah, a million percent. I don't know like how many people would agree with me, because I know like build versus buy is like very culturally like dependent, but especially for small teams or organizations like tight on technical like talent to implement these, like the big benefit you get from cloud managed like solutions is that you offload like more than 90% of your operational like debt load to the cloud provider, right? But that also
mhm.
includes like them also being the best experts in like how to secure like those systems too, right? So you have a small team, you probably want to manage solution. You don't want like two people having to try and manage like implementation of like GDPR like protocols on like your on like an access database like sitting on someone's computer. Like you want Google or Amazon to do that for you, right? Or Microsoft.
Just sorry, one final. Do you think
Yeah.
like the compliance thing is a good driver of change in your organization? Like if you have a smaller company using things like GDPR compliance is a good tool for getting people who may not care as much about data to pay attention to things.
Yes, but like not always in practice, right? Because it's like organizations, I think, will like acknowledge they need these like things in place. So it might compel them to like start up like a data governance like initiative. But like they might only partially like solve the problem for like that very specific requirement. So if they need their data to be like SOC compliant or like have GDPR like control planes in place, they may only solve for those problems versus like the regulatory and compliance problems, versus to me like the larger like end-to-end cultural transformation that's required to get people to really understand like the end-to-end integrity measures you need to really like protect your data, right? It's so much more complex than the regulatory pieces. But I think like to your point, like just in folks I've talked to, like the only way this has been introduced at their company is because they've needed to be GDPR compliant as an example, or get like a SOX check mark.
You need like
Yeah.
a little bit of a threat at start.
Yeah, you just need to have someone, to at least one person in an organization with like some amount of influence to be able to push it beyond like those two like or like this the regulatory place, right? Because you need all teams like buying into it, like all the producers of the data need to be bought in, they need to be also read into how you want to like implement those controls and the technologies you're using to do it.
Awesome, thank you.
No worries.
Vishnush?
So I did my PhD on data governance and nonprofits. So some of your findings are really interesting. So I want to get to your last question, and it kind of seems like there's a ethos out there that you can scrape data from anywhere and you can make profit off it, and keep those data sets intentionally secret or obtrusive, and so on, right? And the nonprofits follow that lead, right? That and OpenAI still is, Parent still is a nonprofit, right? So I'm
Partly.
seeing lots of issues that in that whole data governance supply chain pipeline, like Sambasivan talks about data cascades, like how many of the issues we talk about in terms of bias originate from that initial gathering of data and the whole supply chain. Some I just kind of really disheartened by the models being set and the models being successful commercially.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. Well, I think that this is a place where it's like the thinking through of like governance strategies and architectures for governance, like haven't like quite caught up to like the technological like advances, like especially excuse me, especially around like generative AI that like you flag. So I haven't seen too many discussions like around it. Mostly I've seen like technical like experiments on like how to leverage like LLMs for like improved like web scraping to create like better, more targeted like data sets. But governance in and of itself, we also see governments like struggling to catch up here too, in terms of like how we think about generative like AI and how it plays into like regulatory positions. I think it still needs to be built into the technology stacks as well. But what I flagged like earlier, I didn't get into it. Like, I think this is really where like emerging practices around like AI operations and data operations more generally actually have a very, very strong like role to play, because like these conceptual like and real like architectures give you kind of like the building blocks to like put in all of the controls like that you need to protect like your data or to create trustworthy like data sources. But it's on the operations side where you get the observability into like for machine learning like modeling, like that's where you observe whether there's like model drift. That's where you're able to like generate your statistics around like your data sets, like training or otherwise, that can let you take actions like on them, right? Like the actual like governance like architecture such as fabric or meshes, like again I said, or like conceptual building blocks. It's all how you actually like implement like the cultural like practices around those building blocks that can, I think, get you into like better places. If that makes sense.
If anyone else has any other questions, please feel free to raise your hand or to add it into the chat. Wendy, so with regard to your first question, so how much insight are you given into data governance requirements and challenges in your courses of study? So, I mean, I might be missing something, but I don't think that we provide students with very much of that at all. However, I am teaching in a month. How would you, like, in an ideal world, what does that look like for you? So you have a new graduate out of the University of Toronto. What would you like them to know about this, and how could we go about doing it?
Yeah, I think it's probably like just part of like course structures. Like I flagged it out because when I entered like the industry, I think with one of like the first companies like I worked for, and we had, I think it was like a product or business stakeholder talked about like how we're going to implement data governance. I'd honestly like never heard of it before. Like I didn't know what they were talking about. So as a whole like new, it's probably different now. Like that was a long time ago, but it was like a very novel like concept to me. It's nothing that I had been like introduced to like prior. And I think of like, this is, it's gonna seem like a really weird tangent, but I promise it's related. At one point, when I was doing graduate studies, I was TAing for the civil engineering department. I don't know why, I just was. I was not in civil engineering. Regardless, what I was a TA for was a course within like the civil engineering department at UBC that was on business ethics. Right. So how I connected back to this is that like, you know, like you go to school for like engineering, you want to learn how to like build things. But like a big part of your job, especially in like civil engineering, is to understand like the very, very human implications of like how you're building. So as you went through like your degree program, there were however many courses you had to take on like business ethics or like philosophy of like engineering. And that became part of your generalized education. So I look at like data governance as like a really, really important like component of like data education, right? I know there's dedicated data science programs now, but also in applied statistics, this feels like particularly relevant to me. So I see this as like part of like a more holistic like certification stream. If that makes sense. I don't know if I just talked around the problem.
Kira, did you want to add some context, just by way of background? Kira's a PhD student at the Faculty of Information, but also maintains a full-time job as a data scientist in government. Kira, did you want to add? Or?
I guess just what I said there, that like oftentimes I find that there's kind of two separate streams of like the people doing the data work and then the people figuring out the governance. I see the same thing in my workplace at the time. We're all part of the data office, but there's the data governance people and the data science people. So maybe that's where some of the clashes with regards to your first question there as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. I've seen that too.
Annie?
Yeah, similar to Kira and to Kira's point, I find that with how interdisciplinary data science is, especially as you get into industry, like I have a background in math and stats, but I'm basically the only person on my team with that kind of background. We have people from like completely non-quantitative backgrounds as well, who are self-taught even. I find that the idea of standardizing that in data science as it stands now seems like entirely impossible to me, because where are you supposed to integrate that? And some people get sort of a more ethical or human-centered focus through their non-technical backgrounds, and they bring that to their data science work. And so it's somewhat self-regulating in that sense, but I still see that particularly the academic to industry transition seems kind of very difficult to standardize just by the nature of the field.
Yeah, I'm so curious how like future forward that starts looking as well. Like you're absolutely right. Like my original, I don't know if you can hear my dog barking. Apologies if you can. But like my original like training is in like the humanities. So I came very, very sideways into technology and the data field. So I totally like understand your position there. But like when I was in school, like data science didn't exist, right? So the thing that's like kind of really interesting to me is like the burgeoning of interdisciplinary data science like programs we see at a lot of like educational like facilities, as well as like boot camps, clearly boot camp programs dedicated to this. So I think there's curriculum opportunities to like introduce ideas around data governance, because I think like the education of like data scientists like now is just so fully different from probably when all of us like started, right? Unless we have some very new grads like here as well, right? Like and it's more, to your point, it's more interdisciplinary focused. So it'll be interesting to see where the next generation of data scientists actually come from. I don't really know what to expect. Might be from these programs.
Marcus is just linking to some courses that include the keyword data governance.
Oh, nice.
Are there any other questions or comments? Wendy, do you think? Oh, sorry, are you going on?
I'll share the slide. I'll share the slides with you afterwards too. But just throwing this up for resources if people are interested in the actual like white papers on these.
Yeah, that's perfect. That actually anticipated my question.
Yeah.
Do you think that part of the problem is a clash of cultures, and that's what makes it so difficult to implement these things in organizations? Or is it partially more that there's just inertia and this is just relatively new? And
I think it's all of those things, right? Because it's like you look at like data governance like initiatives, like as part of like larger called like digital transformation strategies at organizations. This is also related to like the challenges of like orgs moving to like clouds, like especially like banks, like it always was like a long-term struggle for them. So like I always do think it's around like the people and the processes never being able to move into operationalization, because like you need alignment across every business unit. Like data governance like can't work unless like the organizational investment is complete, right? You always like see, I talk to like tons of folks who are like, you have like one like data governance like champion at like a massive like multinational like organization, and they have to find like ways to create like a strategy that invites and like integrates and creates like, I'm just going to call it roadmap like plans. Like everyone has to have a share in how they feed into these systems, and you can see how that's like near impossible to get at like enterprise like level without someone really powerful with like the right level of influence being able to like own the outcomes for it, right? Because it's like, you can have a champion, but you need like marketing on side, you need legal on side, you need security on side, you need like all of your individual business units understanding the role they play within the larger initiative, and like actually taking on like the work for their part of like, say, the stack to implement it and get it off the ground, which is why you see it really only like circulating around like, well, we need to be GDPR compliant or we need SOX compliant. So they'll be able to do this one like little piece of it because it's massively critical for like the business. But the things that like actually make it successful over like the long term and like have governance be like a cultural identity for an organization is like really, really hard, right? Because that's your long-term investment and work items like put against maturing this over time. I think it's so hard to do that.
So we're almost at time. It doesn't seem as though there's any other questions or comments. Wendy, do you have any other closing comments or thoughts? Or
No, just like I hope that this was like a little bit interesting to like folks, and you're able to take like some of the thinking like back to your orgs and see how it fits in there. As I said, I think that these are really exciting, like both like the mesh and the fabric are both exciting like concepts, as well as like implementations that can bring a lot more success back to orgs governance like initiatives. So I hope like it's been useful for folks, and really appreciate having the time to talk to you.
no, very much appreciate your talk. Thank you so much. We really appreciate it. Everyone has a very nice week, and we'll see you next week. Nice rest of the day.
Thank you. See
Thanks
ya.
all.